Okay, so it is a great honor and pleasure to be the moderator of this session. So I think before I pass the questions to the audience, maybe I'll just first abuse my power, take advantage of my position to ask each of the speakers a question of my own, if I may. Okay, so first I will just start a question for Prof. Sumit. So Prof. Sumit, I think you mentioned that in general, during this change of water price in Singapore, high-income families and low-income families respond to the price change differently. But I mean, as economists, it just make us think that, well, a high-income and low-income family can be different in many aspects. So to what extent can we attribute to the, let's say, asymmetric reaction or different reaction to income, or the difference between high-income and low-income families in other aspects? So basically, or let's say, do you find some interesting result in your control variables or possible omitted variables and so on and so forth? Thanks.
Before I answer that question, let me just say this. I saw a lot of you taking pictures of the slides. My slides will be publicly available. I've told them to give them to you, so please don't take pictures. I talked to Selena. I think she's also happy to share her slides. So because you're educators, you should be using these slides in your classrooms. That's the whole purpose. I am hoping that... So please do use these slides for your own classrooms. Now to answer the question, clearly, obviously there are differences. We are running regressions, as you guys will understand. We are trying to control for as many variables as possible. And the idea that I was trying to kind of get at in that regression is to show that the rich people don't care about the price. They care only about the announcement, and they react right at the announcement because they realize, look, I might as well try to save water if I can, maybe for environmental reasons, but even for this, but the announcement matters to them. But for the poorer people, for them it is binding, where the money is important. They care when the actual price goes up. So that's the difference we were trying to highlight.
I see. So, or can I just maybe kind of extend it in a way that, so for example, it could also be that in general, high-income families, maybe they have a little bit more kind of education in this kind of ESG concepts, or maybe they just can't afford to sacrifice more monetary value to chase the, let's say, ESG environmental value.
It's possible. There's no way we can tease that out in the data.
Okay, thanks. Then I'll follow with a question to Prof. Nick Padavi. So my question is that the following. So it's actually something like, that could sound very academic. So it's a kind of suggestion for extension work. So I noticed that when you discuss, let's say, the income, how income influence happiness level of families, you are mainly referring to, let's say, the mean income and the variance of income, let's say inequality, which means that in statistics it's a moment one and moment two. So I think that's also going to be familiar with the many teachers of economics seated. So to your knowledge, are you aware that people also work on higher moments, let's say third moment, fourth moment, let's say the kurtosis and skewness of distribution, and whether that can also influence the happiness levels?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm not aware of any studies that looked at that. What I know, of course, the relationship between income and well-being, whether it's cognitive or affective or eudaimonic, it has to be quite salient in people's mind for it to register. So for example, an increase in income, let's say pure absolute income, does lead to an increase in individual well-being for a few moments. And after that, it just goes into our bank account and we don't really think about it anymore. But the salience, which is the word that Prof. Sumit used a lot, is that the relative income is much more salient in our mind. So that's why relative income actually shows up all the time, whether you measure well-being, whatever well-being you're trying to measure. I don't know about the higher moments. I mean, I would be interested to see, although my hypothesis would be that it probably won't have as much if it's not as salient in people's mind. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Or since we're colleagues, you can also consider it like my informal invitation for our future projects. Okay, anyhow, I'll follow up with the third question to Ms. Selina Ling. So, Ms. Ling, I think you mentioned many important aspects of life quality in Singapore, or so to say, in many countries. But let's say, we all know that this year's Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Harvard University professor Claudia Gaudin for her research, pioneering research in gender equality or gender gap in labor markets. So actually, I also have a related question because I really know too little about local knowledge about this. So let's say, what is your view about, let's say, the gender inequalities or equality situation in Singapore? And in particular, like you are a top manager, female top manager, and there are also many initiatives to promote having female leaders of the company, especially top leaders of the company. Can you also share just either knowledge or from personal experience, your perspective on this? Thanks.
Okay, I think if you remember the chart that I had, basically the proportion of men in paid work versus the women, there seems like there is still a gap, although women participation in the labor force has increased over time. So, in the past, people used to talk about a glass ceiling. But I think if you look around these days, whether in public sector or in private sector, you do see a lot of women leaders. So I think, in a sense, a lot of progress has been made. At the end of the day, probably it's not a question of gender, although if you try and measure across the board, because women still do quite a fair bit of the family responsibilities. So I think, like for like, it may not be still at the ideal stage. But, under ESG, under the governance standards, diversity is a very big item on the agenda now. So a lot of the listed companies have made tremendous steps to try and appoint women to the board of directors and also to the managerial roles. So I think sooner or later we'll get there, right? Singaporeans are very competitive. If the regulator says we need to have a certain target, what you measure is what you achieve, right? So I'm quite confident we will get there. But I think it struck me very starkly. We take a lot of things for granted. Because actually, if you look around different parts of the world, women don't enjoy a lot of the liberties that we do here. And in terms of the recognition in the workforce, a lot of things actually are quite commendable. Yep.
I have the impression that Prof. Sumit also wants to join. Yeah, please.
So this is an interesting question on especially the gender gap. This is true around the world. So if you look at in the board of directors or CEOs, and the gap is huge around the world. I mean, 6 to 8% women are only CEOs on board of directors. And the question is why? How can we bridge that gap? Is it in the men's world, they go out and, drink together in the evenings, and because you get to know the boss, then you get promoted, or you play golf together, and that's how you know. So we actually looked at the data for Singapore, and we looked at all golf games played, by who plays golf with who, and does that increase your chances of being on the board of directors? Luckily, you can only do in Singapore because every time you play golf, you have to register your name in Singapore. In America, I can just play golf anonymously. So if you look at it, if women play golf with more management, they're more likely to be directors in Singapore. Significantly, by around 80% probability that you're going to be a director. Now, I'm encouraging all the women to go out and play golf. So we actually document, so we have a series of books in Singapore, they're titled Kiasunomics. So we document all these phenomena about various aspects of Singapore life in those books about showing how you can actually break the glass ceiling.
Shucks, I have to take up golf now.
Nick, can you also say something?
Yeah, of course. I mean, actually, I had a colleague at LSE who also studied very similar things, or using data on lawyers, to see why female lawyers don't get paid as much as male lawyers. And it is partly because female lawyers don't go and mingle with the clients after work, because they have what we call second shift, that they have to go back and do the household chores. Actually, in terms of happiness studies, there's huge evidence as well. What we call the paradox of declining female happiness in the US and in Western society, where the objective quality of life for women have been improving over time, But in fact, the average happiness of females have been declining, absolutely and relatively compared to men. And this is work by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. And they found that partly it's because despite the fact that, you know, objective quality of life for women have been improving, but there's a lot of expectation, stress, and also that the reference groups of women has shifted from other women to men as well. And that's what happens over time. That's why, you know, just kind of corroborate what I said, that if we measured well-being, well-being, we would actually recognize that. And we can do something about it.
Okay, so maybe I should pass the, I think Prof. Kwai has some questions or discussion.
Okay, thanks very much about the, I think this is very interesting discussion in the morning. Now, listening to you all, I just jot down some quick off-the-cuff remarks. To you, Sumit, I think, does that mean that demand for water is price elastic for the lower income households and therefore price inelastic for higher incomes? And then how does that affect policy making in this particular circumstance? And secondly is, have you accounted for the rentals? In other words, when you look at all these flats and making those conclusions, do we really know how many of those proportion are actually rentees, you know, not really the landowners, and because their behavior will be different? And there are also some situations where I know people living in rented places, and if the utility bills are paid by the landowners, then there's a moral hazard issue as well. So these things need to be, I think, considered. And your remarks about green buildings, and I don't know, does that also apply to other types of green goods like electrical appliances and other home appliances? So these are my questions for you. And for Nick, I think you quoted this fascinating study by Oswald. And this brings me the crux of all the behavioral economic studies. A lot of them depends upon mental recollections. So can you say something about how reliable are these mental recollections, like 30 days ago, 1 year ago, 1 week ago, how do you feel, what is different? You know, so there's always this, I often hear this criticism about behavioral economics. Maybe you can dispel that to the audience here. And also, this question about, you talked about Oswald's study about mental depression and so on. Did he, for example, distinguish between degrees of mental depression? Some people have a little minor depression and they were listed as depression. So you may get an overestimate of these results. The other thing is that, do you have information or studies on happiness levels as it correlates to different types of professions? So this, I think, is important for the people here to know. Do these studies correlate well also with different professions and also their productivity? And finally, Selena, I think you presented a whole list of very interesting indicators. My question is, the bottom line, your bottom line, is, are we happy? Yeah, your bottom line, huh? Are we happy? And I've always, in my kind of work, I've always sort of tried to get government to recognize there's a big difference between the decisions based on their own preferences by policymakers and maybe by their own ministry people, right? And many of these are people also very young graduates, you know. Did they go to enough opportunities to go to the ground and get sufficient or elicit preferences from the ground up? You know? So I feel that's very missing. Take, for example, the recent one last year about a tree. This guy went on vacation, you know, and then when he came back after a few days, he noticed that his favorite tree was gone and it was converted to a kind of a bicycle track, which leads to nowhere, actually leads to a car park. So he was very disappointed, and he wrote this in the forum page, protesting about this. So this is, again, people looking from the outside, you know, without eliciting preferences from the ground, makes the decisions about this cycle track is more important than the tree. So I think there should be greater effort by government to elicit all these preferences from the general public before they make these decisions, you know, independently. Okay, I think that's what I have here.
So I think I take your comment seriously that, look, there is obviously some people will be more elastic than others, which is expected. I mean, this is what we would expect. This is what we teach in economics all the time. There should not be uniform elasticity, and it should vary by income and other factors, family size, household size, and things like that. I like your comment on renters versus homeowners. So we spend a lot of time. I mean, I am a micro data guy. If you read any of my papers or even Casunomics, I spend enormous amount of time getting the data right. So we actually looked at it because one of the things that we worried about when we were discussing the green mark building is this, I proposed this hypothesis that the reason the green mark building results are there, that people start spending more or consuming more water, is because of the wealth effect. They feel richer because their house value has gone up. So clearly we had to show that the renters will not be affected by house price effect because they don't get that wealth effect. So we separated out the renters from homeowners, and for the renters, we actually find no effect in their increase in water consumption. So that kind of helps us say that it is the wealth effect that is causing this because the renters are not responding. To your point on renters, on the other studies, we obviously address renters separately. I mean, whatever the data allows, we will dig it, okay? Your broader point about thinking about other factors like is it just green mark buildings or it could be green appliances, those are studies we are currently doing. Water is a big agenda for my research. I really think worrying about energy consumption, whether it be electricity or water, we should drill down and understand how we can think of demand-side solutions as much as we can to reduce or keep it in control.
Thank you, Sumit. Thank you, Yusen, for the questions. So the first one you asked about how we measure mental health and whether or not that's a good measure, because the usual state of whether or not you feel anxious or worry, I mean, it fluctuates from day to day. But if you imagine that it is badly measured, and economists think it is not a perfect measure of anything, but actually nothing is perfectly measured. The fact that we find these badly measured data to predict behaviors, we're actually looking at the at the lower limit of things, because as economists here would know that badly measured data it will bias anything towards zero. The fact that we find anything at all to many should be very surprising. So imagine if we can improve that kind of data, because the actual effect might be much bigger than what we discover. So despite the fact that the measure of mental health and well-being is badly measured, the fact that it predicts something very, very useful, important behaviors, that means a lot, because the true effect will be a lot bigger. And the second question was the well-being of different professions. Of course, I don't know about Singaporeans. I don't think we have data for it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody will tell me that there is actually data on well-being of Singaporeans by profession. But from what I know from other studies that my colleagues have done, let's say in the UK, this is several years back now, I think they find hairdressers to be one of the most fulfilling and happy professions out there. Now, of course, I'm not saying that everybody should become hairdressers, but then we can look at the specifics about being a hairdresser, and that is what comes with being a hairdresser: social connection. Social connection is hugely important. It's part of being a hairdresser. You get to communicate with basically talk. You talk for a living with people. The connectedness, being part of the community, and also flexible hours, from what I've heard. Maybe those are the properties that we can bring over to other professions in the society. So thank you.
Okay, Houston, you asked a very interesting question. The bottom line, are we happy? I would like to ask you back a question, actually. Do you have a reason not to be happy? Because actually, if you look at our life in general, we are materially quite well off. Most of us can find employment. Our children get a very good education. We have a meritocratic society. So there are less worries about corruption or physical safety. So the question is, do we have a reason not to be happy? So if you look at what most Singaporeans grouse about, it will be like, someone is earning $1 million and I'm not, or someone has a bigger house or a bigger car, or why is COE prices so expensive? But these are aspirational, they really are not the basic building blocks. So, I do understand for policymakers, as much as they want to elicit ground feedback, but I always remember what someone shared with me about condominiums and their management committees. If you have attended any of those AGMs for MCs in condos, you realize it's impossible to get a consensus, and vested interest is the name of the game, okay? Meaning that actually the more feedback you get, the more diverse views you elicit, the harder it is to make policy, okay? So I think one of the achievements for the Singapore government is they always take a very long view. I always cite this example, no country in the world will talk about the next 100 years and 100 billion to build to fight climate change. Singapore is really unique in that sense, right? But in that very laser-sharp focus to think about the long term, yes, I think there is room to actually take in more ground sentiment. I think it's important. And I see a lot of these conversations that are ongoing, whether it's Forward Singapore or other stuff. If you are a very hard-nosed person, you'll say all these are just fluff. They don't really move the policy needle that much apart from what they have really decided to do. Okay, that's one very tough approach to it. But the fact is actually they do take a very long view to policy, and they are responsive, I think, increasingly to feedback from the ground. Okay, what I do think there could be room for improvement is this phrase that did come up again in the Forward Singapore report. It's this idea that no one owes us a living. Okay, I don't know how many of you agree with this idea that nobody owes us a living. Okay, one person, very brave person, put up the hand. Okay, I can understand where it's coming from, right? Because of how Singapore was formed and how far we have come, it is true that nobody owes us a living, right? And the fact that we practice meritocracy. But I think going forward, if you're thinking about, if you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of wants and needs, right? When you start out with nobody owes us a living, it's very hard to scale up to the highest pinnacle, which is, what is the purpose of us being here on Earth, or on this little dot called Singapore, right? And I think we have to bridge that gap, right? From just nobody owes us a living, so we need to study hard, we need to work hard, we need to run hard, we need to make sure we always perform, to where are we going as a society? So I think for Singapore, we haven't quite figured exactly the way there. Maybe we're halfway there, but we haven't gotten there yet. So until we find what is the ikigai or the plan de vida for Singapore as a whole, then I think that would be the ideal stage, for Singapore. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions from audience? Yes, please.
Thank you. Probably for Professor Nick, have you seen any studies looking at the effect of social media on happiness and well-being? Because even in countries where the Gini coefficient is very low, we've seen a tremendous mental health issue, especially with youth. And some say, it's between 6 to 10 or 12 hours per day on social media. Have you seen any studies on the impact of that, also on being angrier? You had one slide on the communities are angrier, which is of course fed by social media as well.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, there actually been a few studies that look at mental health and basically life satisfaction of social media users, and typically find it to be a negative correlation. Obviously, and it's very easy to understand, and as you said, even in countries where Gini index is quite low, where there's not a lot of inequality, and that's only because social media opens the world of social comparison. How come I don't have what the other people have? And from what I don't know whether this, there's a study on, but from people who visited Scandinavian countries, for example, where most people don't really care whether or not you have a really flashy cars, because everyone is more equal. But I think the youth who actually influenced by the world about what to have, if you don't have this, you're not happy. Obviously, that's going to be very detrimental to mental health and well-being. So yes, so the answer is simply yes. It's more negative than positive that come out of social media.
Yeah, I think we can still take 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm not an economist, but let me compliment all the speakers. I feel happier after this session. But I also have a question for Professor Padavi on, of course, mental well-being. You've shown a lot of comparisons, and bearing in mind what you showed us at the beginning, your quotation from Joseph Stiglitz about the danger of making the wrong measurements. And I wonder, you I think that Singapore is not doing too badly compared to other countries. But what is the validity of comparing mental well-being between one country and another? I can understand within a society, I mean, you've shown a lot of examples where people, the relative well-being is, if I'm not mistaken, more important when you show income, for example. The comparisons affect your sense of how you're doing rather than the absolute figure of your salary. Now, how far can you extrapolate that? And would it just be within a country? I would think that, especially in a global society like Singapore, you would be comparing with other countries, as you have shown us. So, okay, I'm sorry, I am not getting to the point. But let's use an example of well-being in Singapore. When we read the news, we may not be feeling wonderful, but if you read news, say, about what's happening in Israel, Palestine, the humanitarian crisis there, how would Singaporeans feel? How would a country feel when they read that they are better off than another country? Because we get a lot of news from other countries. But then US, for example, hardly reads about anything except their own country. Have you done studies on this?
Thank you very much for the question. I haven't personally. Now obviously, related to probably Serena's fact as well, maybe we, what is that we shouldn't feel good about? Right? I mean, if you look at Singaporean, very, very lucky. Right? I mean, for example, I'm from Thailand originally. I'm very envious of Singaporeans. Right? The things that are happening here, everything is much better. But the question is, do Singaporeans feel lucky? Let's say if they look to, I don't know, news from abroad. My hypothesis is that probably not. I don't think Singaporeans would feel extra grateful simply because they are comparing across the borders. I think the reference groups are the people here in Singapore. And that's what it is about social comparisons. Now, of course, this is a little bit different from what I said earlier about social media. That, of course, when people comparing upwards or downwards. Now, of course, the point here is that people should be comparing downwards. Look at how lucky we are compared to others. I don't think people necessarily do that. So the reference group here would suggest that. I mean, if I can give a very close to home example. My students at NTU, I gave an example that imagine if your expectation is to, say a really good grade. Say, imagine if you came into my class, you expected to get, 75 out of 100, and you got 80. How happy would you be? And he said, I would be very, very happy. And then I said again, okay, imagine everybody else got 90. And then you can see that happiness just turns into like misery, even though it's much better than what they originally expected. So reference groups matter. So that addressed the social comparison question. The other question is, what about comparing across countries in terms of average happiness? Now you have that's a good point there, and I'm also one of the people who believe that maybe we shouldn't really compare across countries in terms of, let's say, life satisfaction, or or happiness, because there could be a cultural factors that go into it. So, for example, the Japanese would not be willing to say that I'm very, very happy with my life, because it's not the culture to do so. But in terms of mental health, that's quite different. I think I see mental health is more as an absolute measure of how you feel, and that is less relative in terms of the scale. But it still can nevertheless be influenced by your peer groups. I don't know if that answers your questions, all of them, but yes. But I'm happy to chat more about this afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Maybe from audience, from that part of the tables, or let me see, Chu or Walter. Oh, there. Okay. Great, thanks.
Thank you. Right. Good morning. Question is for Professor Sumit. You raised an interesting point on the difference between price and information sensitivity, right? That people respond to prices and a different group of people respond to information. And there is some implication relating to policy outcomes on the idea of having a low salience design for subsidy so that you don't inadvertently affect the market itself. Just like to ask you about what is your stand on what is more important relating to whether the focus should be on or more on price sensitivity or information sensitivity in relation to the measure of consumers or households' response to something changes in prices, for example, as well as whether there is this paradox where it comes to having a low salience design for subsidy, which means that actually the lower income households would then still feel poor, right, even though there's actually some help coming from the government.
So let me try to answer it broadly and then drill down to your specific question. So I think as economists, we want to solve problems. And what we are taught in our standard toolkit is, look, prices will solve most of the things we can try. And I agree with that broadly, that I think the first approach should be trying to use pricing mechanism to get to answers. But beyond that, I think we have to look for behavioral interventions, okay? And there are lots of behavioral ideas that we can use to find solutions. The problem is, pricing is a very blunt instrument. But then when you start looking at these very, instruments which are targeted, like nudging or salience and other things, then you will only achieve very little effect of that. So you want to use the blunt instruments first, then you start using these very targeted instruments, and then achieve additional improvement in the outcome that you want. I think that's the way we should think about solving all problems. And in that sense, if whatever incremental improvement we get with any of these other things is beneficial, you may think of that as a positive externality of what you are trying to achieve. Now to your question about specifically what else can we be doing in terms of solving the water problem or any other demand solutions, I think there are many things, like what we were talking about, that maybe we need to kind of do more interventions with the government in terms of plumbing idea that I was pushing. Or the negative outcomes that I was talking about, the green mark building, that in fact, instead of reducing water, increased water consumption for consumers, and where that effect is coming from. So I think till we study these things, we don't know what the problems are and what the right solutions will be for them. I don't know if I answered all of your questions, but I can talk to you later as well.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Or maybe I can quickly follow up, because I also have something I want to share about the gender topic. topic we just discussed. Actually, because I do some behavior experimental finance research, and a very common and robust finding in my literature is just that in general, I mean, although financial industry is predominantly occupied by men, but actually men can easily suffer from overconfidence or excessive risk-taking, which is actually not so good for financial stability. And of course, I know that Singapore market suffered less from instability compared to other markets, but still, since we have so many economics and finance female students nowadays, I just think that, well, in the future, I'm confident, we're confident to see that there should be more and more women in this market and also take top leadership. And also, I do think that all of us should take all the effort to make it happen. Yeah.
Actually, if I can share, when I started with OCBC, there were distinctly fewer women analysts and economists in the industry. So it took me quite a while to build a team up till last year to get it up to 50% women representation. But it is done. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe one more question. We still have 3 or 4 minutes. One more question. Or can be comments, anything. Or if there's no question, can we end a bit earlier? Since I think everyone probably also want to have lunch.
Early lunch makes people happy, I think.
Yes. Okay. She said time is up. The judge said the time is up. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much for the speakers.
Many thanks to the speakers and the moderator again.